Well, we're dealing with Tower of Babel, and I found a lot of interesting thoughts about it that hopefully you'll find interesting too. But one of the points, Nahum and Sarna, the Hebrew biblical scholar, pointed out that the source of the actual storyline wasn't borrowed completely from the Babylonian sources because the themes were too contrary. They were in criticism and using irony about the Babylonian religion and people, so it couldn't have been just borrowed completely from them. So he said, although there are some literary connections, but it was picking up some ideas and then creating a whole story in itself. And where it also points out that the Tower of Babel story, even though it seems to be kind of just dropped in the midst of the league of or the recording of all the nations and naming them, in the greater long-term and broader view of the biblical story, that the Yahwist and the priestly versions coming together by the redactor who created Genesis, the book of Genesis, it's a turning point, a transition point of that story. If we kind of rehearse it, we have creation in the beginning. God created everything and created these human beings and then wanted them to go and be fruitful and fill the earth. And then they get started doing that, and then all this corruption takes place because in the heart of man, he thinks of nothing but evil from the very beginning, and so we have the flood, and then God repents of having done that, and then starts over and tells them to go and be fruitful and fill the earth from the three sons of Noah. And so right in the middle of all of that, then drops this story of the Tower of Babel. But it's a shifting point, but there are some assumptions in this story, and it's a simplistic view, a childlike view in a way, that the people from the very beginning all had one language, and they all knew one Creator God. They hadn't developed the pagan religions yet. However, in the list of the tables, as I pointed out last week, a table of nations, growing out of Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, all the different ethnos, nations, have their own languages, their own customs, and their religions. Although it doesn't say they have their religions, it's assumed with all the customs, and their own separate territories and lands. The etiologies, those little stories that about place names and groups of folks and customs and habits of how it came to be. When did it start? What was the first thing? And a story will talk about that first thing. Sometimes these etiologies not only tell the story of how, but also the why. Why did that come to be? Why as cause and effect, and also why as purpose. What's the purpose of this? The reason behind it. And in biblical terms, why God made things happen that way. The Tower of Babel is a how we got different languages, but also a why. Why God caused it to happen in that story. So in the storyline, there is God's command, God's will, that the human beings spread across the earth, multiply and fill the earth with life as a part of creation, and the whole animal kingdom. We're all a part of that, and God starts it in one little place in the biblical view, and then says, go forth and fill the earth. And then after the flood, the same thing, everything's destroyed. We have one spot with, this ark full of all these pairs of animals and the human beings, and then God says, go forth and repopulate the earth. But it's repopulate the earth with life and God's whole plan. It isn't the idea that the earth is full of everything else except the human beings, and then God says, spread out, and everything's out there waiting for you, but it's a part of the development of God's ecosystems that human beings are a part of. So that's the beginning of the story, but as they begin to go and spread across the earth, it says then they decide they don't want to do it. There's a rebellion. The people say, let's stop and build a city and a tower and make a name for ourselves. So it's seen as a deliberate attempt to thwart God's will. So if we follow Vaughters' view that the tower story is connected to the literary account in the Babylonian Enuma Elish, and that the city with its tower in that story is so intimately connected to, one, the polytheism of the tower as the gathering place of the gods, to pay homage to Marduk, the chief god, and secondly, the capital city of this ruthless empire, with its values and goals and purposes so alien and contradictory to the Hebrews' revelation of faith and values. Both the religious values, the tower, and the secular empire values of city are symbolized here as contrary to God's will. And so that's a kind of backstory or underlying theme in this story. And to make a name for ourselves, a sense of arrogance, of self-sufficiency. The name and the reputation are based upon, in the Babylonian style, domination, violence, injustice, and destruction. It's not upon life and harmony and justice. As I said a moment ago, before and after the flood, the desires of man's heart are evil from the start. And this becomes another example of that theme, to make a name for ourselves. Now, Nahum Sarna says, in that sense, it's not an individual kind of thing, I want fame and glory idea, but it's in the seat of power that the kings had building projects. They would try to do great things to be their legacy. They will be remembered as a great king because of all these edifices that they built. For Rome, it's the Colosseum and the great arches, triumphal arches, and so forth, and the water systems that they would build, temples and so forth. These monumental efforts of the kings to build these great edifices was to make a name for themselves. So that connection of empire building and name building of rulers is an underlying part of this story that's held up in contempt as contrary to God's will and God's purposes for the human endeavor. So like Pharaoh, who builds monumental efforts to build the pyramids, this will make a name for themselves, but the way it has to come about is with the heavy taxation of the people, the forced labor and enslavement of people to do the work, the injustice and hardship of those enterprises on the common people and on the masses. You have a small wealthy elite in power, but as it trickles down, the masses suffer for making this name. So urbanization is often looked at by biblical scholars as a part of what's being criticized here, and what happens, the inhumanity of urbanization that often follows, in contrast with the pastoral and simple life of the shepherd and the herder, who, by the very nature of being nomadic, keep looking for new pasture land, spread out. They go farther. They're not pulling everything into a center of an urban area or a city, but rather spreading out. So the building of the tower, the ziggurat, is mankind's effort to reach up into the sky. And here's another element of the arrogance of the story, to make a holy mountain. You know, lots of places like the Hebrews and the movies about Moses that we've seen, he didn't have to build a mountain. The mountain was already there. And I lift up my eyes unto the hills. From whence will my help come? My help will come from the Lord who made heaven and earth and the mountains. Not that we've got to build a mountain ourselves. Now, even though the religious intent to meet God, it is prideful and arrogant in that the attempt to create the mountain is seen as one's trying to become equal to God, come up to God's level on our own efforts to rise up to God's height instead of humbly bowing in God's presence. So these are subtleties that are in the story that we can just blow right by unless we're a biblical scholar and spend hours and weeks and months poring over these and reading them over and over and over again. And all of a sudden, pop, I didn't see that before. That's what's there. But anyway, they do that for us, and we're blessed because of it. But anyway, that aspect of it's human enterprise, human ingenuity. We don't need God to create mountains. We can build our own. So there's that element. Of course, the other part of it is where they're seeing this take place is on a plain like in the middle of western Kansas. There aren't any mountains out there, or the Oklahoma Panhandle. If we want to meet God and have this image that we meet God by going up on a mountain, then how are we going to do that out there? Well, I guess we got to get a bunch of dirt movers and build our own little mountain. But anyway, that's some of the geography behind this, but still the themes are there. And then another aspect, the Hebrew folks, where they lived, there were lots of rocks and stones. They could build things out of rocks and stones, and they didn't have to bake the bricks. And in one sense, that could be a sense that bricks do tend to crumble. If they get moisture and gets into them and they crack and break. Anybody have bricks flaking off on the outside in your house? They don't last forever. And so a part of this mountain and this monument is the idea it will last forever. It'll make a name for ourselves. But yet it's a kind of maybe a little tongue-in-cheek. It's made out of bricks. It isn't going to last forever. But the stone, things made out of granite and so forth, will maybe last forever. Sort of like Mount Rushmore. Anybody seen that? That the guy who designed that planned for it to weather. So he made things a little larger, so planned for it to weather. So it would last longer. So anyway, now I was cleaning up my desk, and which I do from time to time, and it doesn't ever seem to do any good because it always gets messy again. But I was finding some old notebooks and seeing what was written on them to see if I could tear it off and put it in the recycle bin, or if I need to save it. And I came across these notes in a sermon preparation for I don't know when, a long time ago, but it was Pentecost. So the Tower of Babel story is not mentioned anywhere else in the Old Testament, and Nahum in Sarna said, this story is so full of images and themes. Why didn't the other biblical writers grab a hold of it and use it for their commentary? And they just didn't. But we waited till the New Testament in Acts 2, where we have this story. When the day of Pentecost had come, and they were all together, meaning the disciples, in one place after the crucifixion of Jesus, the 50 days, and suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. And I think the tongue means it wagged and looked like somebody's wagging tongue. But all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under the heaven living in Jerusalem. Now they have been scattered, but yet they had come home for Passover. So we've got those in the diaspora who had been scattered by other things had come home for the holy holidays. And anyway, from every nation under heaven, living in Jerusalem, and at the sound of the crowd they gathered, and they were bewildered because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans?" Now that's kind of a poor, uneducated part of Palestine, by and large. How could they learn all these languages? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power. All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine." But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them, "Men of Judea, and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and listen to what I say. Indeed, these men are not drunk, as you suppose, for it is only 9 o'clock in the morning. No, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel." And then he goes on and preaches a long sermon, and then 3,000 of those folks hear the message and respond. And the church is born. Birthday of the church, we say. Now, from that, we have New Testament scholars have interpreted that's looking back to the Tower of Babel story when everybody's languages were scrambled and they dispersed. Now we have an ingathering and overcoming that Jesus, after all that history of the Hebrew people, is bringing it back together as a part of God's plan. That's the long-range plan from Christian perspective. But the miraculous and unique special experience or the event in the history of the world, or at least the Christian church, is this Pentecost event. But it was unique and unusual and miraculous in its way. But it's hard to describe and explain it. We still have problems trying to really interpret it. Some use this as saying that this was the glossolalia, the speaking in tongues, but as the text says, it's in their own languages. It was understandable. And so we've had 2,000 years later, and in the translations from the Aramaic into Koine Greek and into English and then to various English translations, it's still confusing. All of that hadn't made it perfectly clear because we can't send all of our news reporters there with cameras and microphones to capture it and then analyze it to death. We just have the story. But this is often used to interpret it just saying that there were actual physical things, the visual things of the tongues of fire over their head, and the physical aspect of the rush of wind, which we have good knowledge of here, tornadoes and those sheer winds of there was the last big storm we had here that ruined so many trees. We understand the power of wind and the sound that it makes. But were these actual sights and sounds and physical effects of the winds actually blowing through the room, or was this just a more poetic and symbolic way of saying this was such a powerful experience. It was as if, or these metaphors borrowed from the physical reality to capture the sense of the power and energy that filled the room, in which everyone felt and experienced it. Today, we might use the word electrifying. Well, if we're using electrifying, we don't mean everybody falls over dead on the floor from a power surge that electrified them and killed them, but it's an emotional electric. We can just feel it, and the emotion, can make goosebumps come up on your skin, and the hair on the back of your head, right? These are physiological responses to an inward emotional experience. But we won't know for sure. But the second is the utterance of speech that came out of this, and like I said, some interpret it as glossolalia, but it says it's which is a prayer language. But this is communicating to others. The speech is intelligible in the other languages, but in one sense, there's another way that it might mean that these Christians who had been in hiding and afraid may have, out of this experience, found their voice and were willing to speak out in public. Something had to turn that around from being hiding and afraid to having courage and finding their voice and speaking out and proclaiming this about Jesus. And so that's where the comparison of the Genesis story comes in. It's the Babel story in reverse, and that's all being reversed. But the people in the Babylonian or the Tower of Babel story wanted to stop and build their tower to make this meeting place between God and people, between heaven and earth, to where they go up and try to build up. The Pentecost story is God comes down. God's Spirit comes down and finds the people and enters into them, which is another contrast there. Now, God is not pleased with the people in the Babylonian tower, or the Tower of Babel story, with the human arrogance and so forth, and human technology and ingenuity trying to go meet God. Nahum and Sarna, in another place in his analysis, says it's not the people who control the relationship between people and God. It is God's initiative, and it's what God does, and we are the ones who need to be open and receptive to what God does. It doesn't mean that we're passive, but that we need to do things to be open, but we do not control it by what we do. And that's his little take on that subtle difference and the contrast. And then also, again, when we see the great evils of oppression and injustice occur, when the powerful human rulers seek a totalitarian control over the people to unite them in these grand enterprises of building cities and glorious palaces and temples. And as I said, we've got Pharaoh's oppression, which the Hebrew people understood well, to build great monuments. We saw, well, I didn't see him, but some of you saw Adolf Hitler's efforts to build a great empire and how he oppressed the people, and Joseph Stalin oppressing the people to build the great structures in their systems and to unite the world in creating what in Star Wars would say the evil empire. It's a different kind of thing. But their visions of how the world should be ordered and organized had disastrous effects. Instead of turning to God's plan, God's design to organize and order the world. But the mentality of the systems of domination really turns to an idolatry of the state. The state becomes the ultimate thing that controls our life, that in a sense we need to worship. We need to bow down to it. And not just the ruler, but the whole idea that this is the most important entity in the universe, is our nation, our state, and we have to dominate the others in order to maintain our glorious position. And it involves all kinds of injustices. But symbolically, God confuses the language so that they will disintegrate that effort. Now, one of the things that's kind of ironic, I studied a little teaching company course on utopias, and if we look at it, Hitler had a utopian worldview. If we look at it in one way, he wanted to create a master race, to make everything perfect according to his vision. But in order to do that, he had to enact a lot of unjust and unfair policies. But to have a master race, you have to eliminate the defects and not care for those who aren't perfect. And so that led to, just horrible things. And he could decide who was perfect and who was imperfect. And then imperfect should be eliminated in order to have the master race. Now that gets to that fallacy that a good and noble end or purpose justifies whatever means it takes to get there. The end justifies the means. So I'm trying to do good, and as Stalin said, you have to break some eggs to make an omelet. That concept, and that's not what we find in our tradition. We see that as wrong. If the means that you use to have your goal or purpose are unjust, unfair, wrong, it's like I need to go rob a bank so I can have money in order to start this charity that helps the poor people. Call me Robin Hood. Well, the means, the good I intend doesn't justify the means I use to accomplish that. But in politics, we see a lot of means, or the end justifies the means. I am the best candidate, and when I get elected, I will bring salvation to this city or to this world or this country. But in order to get there, I can lie, cheat, steal, stab people in the back. But I've got a good end and purpose, because once I get into the office, then I've got this grand plan to make everything perfect. If you'll do it on the way getting there, you're probably going to do it when you get there too. So, character and track record are very important. Anyway, so let's see, where am I? We're down here. Okay, so anyway, the point I was making was the connection with the Pentecost story, that this Tower of Babel story really isn't picked up and used again until we get to New Testament times and have the Pentecost story of the birthday of the church. What's the reference? Act 2, chapter 2 is where that starts, and then it just goes on and on and on with other quotes from Old Testament and a long sermon. Once he found his voice, like a lot of preachers, he didn't know when to shut up and sit down. He just kept going on and on and on. However, it was a big event, and we needed to do that, have that word spoken. Walter Brueggemann, in his commentary on Genesis, observes some other interesting things, and he sees a dialectic between the unity and the scattering back in the Tower of Babel story. In Genesis 10:32, we have the expression that from these, the three sons, the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood. And then in Genesis 11:4, the words of the people who don't want to do that anymore, he says, it has the phrasing, otherwise we will be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Spread abroad, God's plan. Scattered abroad, the worry and the fear of the people who stop and build a city. Spread abroad is God's will. The fearful people are afraid of being scattered. Now, for the Israelites' experience, defeat and being conquered as a people and exiled, carried off to unknown places, Babylonian captivity, for example, or their own fleeing. We see today so many people flee in the midst of civil war, in the midst of invasions. They become immigrants, refugees, trying to flee. Well, when the violence starts and the bad things happen, people are scattered abroad, the diaspora. And so this scattering or spreading can be a positive thing or a negative thing. Here in our national history, we've got the potato famine in Ireland, and for those experiencing it, a lot of death and misery, but it did create a spreading abroad, and a lot of folks felt that ended up being a blessing of coming to the United States with all the opportunities. But yet, on the other hand, folks back in Ireland, some of our best talent left. And so it can go either way. But in the Israelites' experience, the defeats and the conquering and the scattering from bad things had a common ring to it as something to be avoided, something to not let happen to you. So scattering is not positive. It's associated with being a bad thing, so they want to avoid it. But in the story of spread abroad, from God's view, it's positive, for it's following the flow of life and vitality, growth and development according to God's plan. You fill this area, you have kids, and you just get property down the road, and they start their farms, and then their kids, and so the whole community fills this area with farms, and we're all kinfolk. So be careful when you get appointed to a small farming community and you say something uncomplimentary about so-and-so, and it fits. They deserve an uncomplimentary comment about their behavior, but the whole clan gets mad at you. Reminds me of my first appointment. You want to hear that story? My first appointment, the roof leaked. We needed a new roof. My dad was a general contractor in the Oklahoma City and Norman area. I call him, we need a new roof. Who do you recommend? Oh gosh, I've forgotten the name of it. It's a big one, a big roofing company, but they are, they've got labor contracts, and so they have to bid a certain way because they have to use the labor that's in the labor unions, but they have a non-union small company for small jobs, and he says you can trust them, they do quality work. So I recommended that to the trustees, but they said we want to use this local guy. So I called my dad and I checked and he checks with the roofing folks, and they say, he's a crook, don't use him. He's the brother-in-law of the board of the trustees chair. I didn't make a lot of friends. They went with him. I said, it's okay. It's, whatever you want to do. I'm just reporting, trying to save us. But anyway, I went on from there to a great and successful career in the Methodist Church. I'll show you some more of my scars one of these days, but anyway. But I learned a lesson there. Whenever you go to a new church, get a big chart and make the family tree of the church membership so you know who's connected to whom, and because you can get right in the mess of feuds and all kinds of stuff if you're not careful that have nothing to do with the life and ministry of the church and God's purposes. But anyway, so back to the Tower of Babel. The story of being spread abroad is positive in God's sense of trying to fill the earth according to God's plan with healthy ecosystems of which human beings are a part. Brueggemann points out two kinds of unity. One is a unity that permits scattering or spreading out abroad because all are in the covenant with God, and it's unity in diversity, but we're all doing God's will wherever we are, fulfilling God's purpose, which keeps us unified in the grand scale, the worldwide long-range plan. The scattering in God's will is that life should be peopled with God's regents. We're God's image, and that we're attentive to all the parts of creation working in God's benevolent, caring image to enhance the whole creation and bring each in its own kind to full fruition and productivity. And in environmental science and ecosystems thought, means every species has a role in the ecosystem for the general good. And we need to maintain that for the general good and our health and prosperity as well. It is God's Spirit and God's overarching wisdom and purpose that coordinates and holds it all together if we human beings people and enter into this covenant with God's flow and God's plan. In a conventional reading, it sees confusing language and scattering as punishment, and that is seen as a bad thing. But Brueggemann then lists three ways to see the unity and scattering. The unity of the people to resist God's plan and God's way out of fear and ignorance. We see a lot of people coming together with great power and force. When they're doing something wrong, we would call it mob violence. When folks come together and it becomes violent and destructive, and often they think they're doing something right, but careful analysis will often show that was wrong. Scattering is seen as punishment by God, but there's the unity that's willed by God in this covenant relationship. The scattering that the people fear is as autonomous parts, each looking out for the self and fighting over the limited resources. And so that's what happened in that scattering. They weren't spread abroad doing God's will, but they scattered as autonomous entities who formed little groups of tribes who then fought each other over limited resources instead of working together for the overall common good. It created a fortress mentality. Bring this all together and be a coercive uniformity of one group, and this kind of unity then focuses on sameness and then becomes oppressive because we see ourselves as over and against the other that becomes enemy, and it creates this awful tension and problem between us. Brueggemann had some other thoughts that are so apropos to today and what our nation has just gone through in Washington. We have this language issue. There's unity and diversity, there's scattering and division, but then and the time left, I'm not going to paraphrase it. I'm just going to read it as he says it. And anyway, the text encourages reflection upon language as a peculiarity important to human activity. It raises important questions about how we speak and how we listen and answer. It asks about the quality of human communication and the function of language. The faithful community exists, among other things, to maintain a faithful universe of discourse against the languages around us which may coerce, deceive, manipulate, and mystify, and twist and pervert the truth. But language is decisive for the shape and quality of human community. More than anything else, language determines the way in which human persons care for each other. Language shapes the ways in which human communities conduct their business and arrange power. Language is the way we bestow upon each other the gifts of life and death. In a positivistic society, language is conventionally understood simply as descriptive of what is. When language only describes what is, it inevitably becomes conservative. It tends to become ideological, giving permanence to the way things presently are. The language in serious community need not be only descriptive of what is. It can be evocative and creative, calling into being things that do not exist. Such language is the way of promise and of hope. And because such speech calls into existence things that do not exist, it is dangerous and subversive speech. It stands characteristically over against things as they are. This text invites reflection on the possibility of language and on the dangers of language misused. Language not only reports but shapes power relations. Language can be coercive, or it can liberate those who speak and those who listen. It is apparent that Jesus' speech was liberating, but those who did not want the world changed and power redistributed rightly viewed his speech as subversion. In that context, we may note that God did what God did to interrupt the tower building in our narrative. While verse 7 is conventionally translated, that they may understand, the word in the text is shema. It permits the rendering that they do not listen to each other. Rather than the not understanding because something's wrong with the speech, it's the other side, not understanding because won't listen. If the word is rendered understand, it may reflect only a verbal semantic problem, but if it is translated as listen, the text may pose a covenantal theological issue. We may usefully reflect on what makes it possible for people to listen to each other and what makes listening difficult or impossible. The capacity to listen in ways which transform depends upon trust in the speaker, readiness to be impacted, and willingness to have newness come into one's life. Such speaking and listening is the intended mode of speech in the Bible from the first chapter of Genesis, but the Bible offers many evidences of listening failures, not grounded in trust or readiness for newness. While many texts may be cited, we may consider Genesis 42:21, in which the brothers admit not listening to Joseph. They did not listen because they feared, resented, and hated. Failed speech is linked to the disappearance of trust. Not listening is related to the death in relationship, the death of a relationship. To fail to listen means to declare the other party null and void. A society which suffers failed speech, as in our text, not only cannot build towers, it cannot believe promises, cannot trust God, cannot be human. The consignment of humanity to not listening subsequently becomes an indictment against Israel. If we translate that to the failure to listen is an indictment on Congress. And I think it gets to the heart, not trusting the other. I mean, it is so frustrating that in Congress, folks are seen as enemy rather than the loyal opposition, rather than ones who believe in the country and the country's good and the people's good and have a different understanding of how to get there. No, it's an idea of you are the enemy. You are the enemy. You are unconstitutional. You are unpatriotic. You are evil, is what the spirit up there is. And that is sick. That is sick. And I'm hoping that from what transpired last week, folks will start waking up and learning to listen and converse and trust one another. And I'm not sure how much we can do about it other than vote better next time. But listen to, what's in the heart and the track record of folks that are running and what kind of decisions and thoughts and where their heart is and whether they practice the end justifies the means kind of philosophy, or if they're principled for the greater good and not for individual glory and so forth. Let us pray for ourselves and our world. Dear God,